Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community, and all who wish to join us online, science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get through these difficult times. Today I'm joined by Dr. Dan McKanan. We will be talking about Harvard's connection to Unitarian Universalism and Dan's latest research on the urban wild. Dan is the Ralph Waldo Emerson Unitarian Universalist Association Senior Lecturer in Divinity at Harvard Divinity School. He is the author of Prophetic Encounters, Religion in the American Radical Tradition, which won the Frederic G. Melcher Book Award. He also served as the lead editor of the two-volume documentary History of Unitarian Universalism, and his most recent book is Camphill in the Future, Spirituality and Disability in an Evolving Communal Movement. By way of full disclosure, Dan was also my PhD advisor at Harvard. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with you and all the people of your congregation and beyond.
We're very glad to have you here, and I thought we could just start out with a real nuts and bolts question of asking you to talk about your position at Harvard. Can you tell us about the history and function of the Emerson Chair?
Absolutely. I am the first person who's been able to hold the Emerson Chair at Harvard. It was created just about a little bit more than a decade ago to renew Harvard's historic connection with Unitarian Universalism. So as Emerson Senior Lecturer, I work closely with people preparing for Unitarian Universalist ministry at Harvard Divinity School, and I also work very closely with the national network of people who are doing doctoral work in some kind of relationship to Unitarian Universalism, either because they are themselves Unitarian Universalist or because their research topic relates to Unitarian Universalism. So my position was relatively recently created, but Harvard's historic connection to Unitarian Universalism, particularly to the Unitarian side of the family, goes back for centuries. The people who created the Unitarian side of our denomination, which was formally organized as a denomination in 1825, were the same people who had organized Harvard Divinity School as a distinct part of Harvard University 9 years earlier in 1816. People like William Ellery Channing were in the room where it happened for the creation both of the Divinity School and the Unitarian denomination. And that was because Harvard was the place where the children of the Puritans gradually absorbed the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment, and that absorption of Enlightenment ideas took fruit in the creation both of the Divinity School and of the Unitarian denomination as they were parting ways with the more conservative heirs of the Puritans who wanted to preserve their inherited Calvinist theology. So in the almost 200 years of shared history that the Divinity School has with the Unitarian denomination, they have evolved in parallel, sometimes working very closely together, sometimes working separately, but still going in similar directions, particularly going towards more emphasis on religious diversity. So just as Unitarian Universalism today encompasses Jewish, Buddhist, pagan, atheist, humanist, Muslim individuals, so too Harvard Divinity School prepares people to lead religious communities within all the religions of the world and to conduct scholarship on all the religious traditions of the world. Within that rich mix, our cohort of Unitarian Universalist students play a really important role of keeping our community connected to the history that gave birth to that diversity.
Well, thank you for that overview. And I think that because there's been so much work within the Unitarian Universalist Association and struggle within the Unitarian Universalist Association around the question of dismantling white supremacy, particularly starting, I guess, is it 3 years ago now? 4 years ago now, around a sort of hiring controversy under the tenure of the former UUA president that led to kind of widespread pushback and the formation of the Commission on Institutional Change, which has really done kind of a big audit of Unitarian Universalists' history of relationship to white supremacy and what it might be doing in the future to dismantle that. I thought maybe you could kind of talk about that particular parallel between Harvard's own effort to struggle with its legacy of white supremacy, in some ways continuing, I'm sure, to reproduce white supremacy, and in other ways trying to create spaces to envision and build a multiracial university. So if you could talk about those parallels, I think that would be really fascinating for people to hear about.
Yeah, one of the really great gifts of being in accountable covenant relationship to two institutions, Harvard Divinity School on the one hand and Unitarian Universalism on the other, is that I get to see and compare the ways they grapple with urgent issues such as the struggle to dismantle white supremacy. And I would say, obviously Harvard's, both of these institutions have benefited enormously from white supremacy. Harvard is well known as having the largest university endowment in the world. And pretty much whenever you see an endowment, you can be confident that white supremacy is involved. A lot of my colleagues in the Harvard History Department have done really important research showing the ways that the emergence of Western capitalism simply would not have been possible apart from the white supremacist context in which it took place. The accumulation of capital that made Harvard's endowment possible resulted directly from the expropriation of Native American lands and the expropriation of African and African American labor. So whether, in some cases we can trace a particular endowment very directly to a particular slave trading family or a particular cotton industrialist, but one way or the other, the endowment as a whole is connected to this legacy of white supremacy. So there's a deep history, and there's also a lot of really contemporary challenges. So the challenges that we have encountered in Unitarian Universalism have often focused on issues of hiring. We know that when people of color are called to congregational ministry more frequently than other people, those ministries are disrupted in one way or the other. In many cases, because congregations are not able to make that kind of cultural leap to embrace the distinct gifts of a minister from a different background from the majority of the congregation. At the level of the Unitarian Universalist Association, as you mentioned, Colin, we had a particular struggle because during the Peter Morales administration, the clear and overwhelming majority of the top leadership of the Unitarian Universalist Association were white people, even as many of the lower level employees of the UUA were much more diverse. And in the wake of one particular hiring decision, people of color raised their voices, people of color who were already gathering with one another for mutual support, spoke out about the ways in which potential candidates who were more diverse, and diverse in multiple ways, right? So the leadership had been dominated by white male ministers, and Chris Rivera, who was a Latina religious educator, shared her own experience, but raising the larger question of, are women given the same consideration in applying for staff positions? Are people of color given the same consideration? And are religious educators and other sorts of religious professionals given the same consideration as ordained ministers? So a very intersectional approach to how we choose our denominational leaders. And in the wake of that conversation, Unitarian Universalism made a very intentional decision through the work of the Commission on Institutional Change to model our national leadership on the kind of movement we want to be. And this is really visible at the level of General Assembly, as well as at the level of the UUA staff that has been pulled together by President Susan Frederic Gray. And Harvard is very much involved in a similar process, but in different ways. And I would tend to say at a kind of a different step along the path. So part of what happened in Unitarian Universalism was a shift from a paradigm of saying, let's make sure we don't discriminate against people of color or religious educators, lay people, women in our hiring decisions, to a new paradigm of saying, let's try to recruit the leadership who will help us become the beloved community we aspire to be. And I think in general, Harvard is still at the place of saying, let's try not to discriminate in our hiring, but is moving towards realizing the need for a greater level of intentionality about who we bring into leadership positions. A great example would be something that I've been able to see over the 12 years I've been at Harvard, is that even if we're tolerably successful at hiring new faculty who are women and people of color, we're much less successful at retaining those faculty over the long term. So there have been a few cases where beloved teachers who were people of color, both at the Divinity School and other parts of Harvard, were denied tenure. But even more numerous than those are the cases of people of color faculty colleagues who receive tenure and leave for another university almost immediately after receiving tenure. Probably for a different reason in each individual case, but it has happened enough times that we're beginning to realize there's something fundamentally awry, and we need to look at that. Another really interesting experience we've had at the Divinity School that we're still trying to make sense of is at the level of student recruitment. We've had a very energetic activist admissions staff for many, many years, and they created a great program called Diversity and Explorations that brings diverse students for a deep campus immersion to help them think about, basically to help them imagine themselves at Harvard Divinity School. So this program targets mostly people of color, also people from impoverished and working class backgrounds during their undergraduate years, who are perhaps thinking about Divinity School but haven't decided for sure, and they come to our campus, they experience our classes, they do a lot of workshops about professional development. They learn about the process of apply, not just to us, but to other divinity schools. And a great many of them wind up coming to Harvard Divinity School. That program really accounts for the majority of the improvement that we've made in the diversity of our student body. And we call these folks DivX alums because they participated in this program. And one of the things that DivX alums tell us over and over and over again is that the Harvard Divinity School that they experienced during the DivX program, when their particular experiences of people of color, often first-generation college students, are at the center of attention, that experience is not fully replicated in what they encounter when they actually enroll at Harvard Divinity School. So our challenge is to say, can we make ourselves in actuality the same sort of empowering, inclusive community that we can convincingly portray ourselves as when we're trying to recruit diverse students? And that's a big open-ended challenge for us right now.
I mean, I think that's a, if I can be sort of theologically wonkish for a moment, interesting, ontological note, right? That I feel like I see within Unitarian Universalism too, where people report of going to things like the Blue Gathering and Black Lives Unitarian Universalist Gathering and talk about how it's this sort of radically different experience of space and feel like they never were as both authentically Unitarian Universalist and able to live into their sort of experience of being a Black Unitarian Universalist or a person of color Unitarian Universalist in that space, and feel, I mean, I've talked to a number of people who went to the National Blue Gathering and felt just totally on fire afterwards. And yet, coming back into a church space or a local congregation space that doesn't represent that at all, or, only in very, very limited ways. And that kind of tension between, the sort of utopian and the permanent. I mean, I think it's actually on some levels a core religious experience, right? I mean, like we see this within sort of the tensions between like revivals and Sunday morning church services, for instance. But it's also, I think, a real question when we're thinking about like social change and transformation. It's very easy, I don't know if easy, it's possible to create these sort of utopian spaces. Again, we could gesture towards like Occupy Wall Street or the protests that have been happening around Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd, where these new forms of city or new ways of community that are multiracial, that are anti-capitalist, that are coming into being and are offering life-changing experiences for people, but then the tyranny of ordinary time and ordinary space and white supremacist logics reassert themselves because they're so strong and powerful. And it's not to say that those experiences of, you could call it freedom, you could call it autonomy, you could call it living into an actual anti-racist community, are then, they're not lost, but then they're not there in kind of a permanent, ongoing way. And I feel like, I don't think anyone has ever solved that dilemma, right? I mean, like Martin Buber, famously wrote extensively on that very dilemma between the I thou, the I it, and the utopian and the prophetic and paths to utopia and elsewhere. But I think that that's sort of like somehow at the heart of this challenge that institutions like the Unitarian Universalist Association, Harvard Divinity School, and frankly, this country face when we're trying to dismantle these deep-rooted institutions.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking of gets at a real important challenge for social transformation, and I think one of the places where processes of social transformation can stall out. Because this tension that you describe between the utopian experience of living into a new sort of community and then the tyranny of the ordinary, of going back into the institutions that are unchanged, that's really hard on people. And in some ways, the pain that one experiences in that tyrannical ordinary situation may actually be deepened, or at least brought closer to the surface, maybe the opposite of deepened, by the juxtaposition to the utopian alternative. So, for example, the reality of police officers killing black and brown people has been a reality for as long as there has been a United States of America. This is not a new phenomenon, but the fact that in the past several years, it is an old phenomenon that has again and again been captured on video camera and thus exposed to the eyes of the nation is not only pricking the conscience of a lot of white people, it's also creating a new sort of pain for many black and brown people who are reminded in such a pointed way of the vulnerability of their bodies to police violence. And it's not my place, to say what the difference is between that sort of pain and the kind of pain of being vulnerable in ways that aren't, on the national news. But it can be, institutions, I guess, can often have the feeling like, why is this suddenly so much more difficult now that we're talking about forms of violence that have been with us for centuries? Maybe it was easier when we didn't talk about those things. It can be very tempting to kind of jump back on that the very things that are potentially moving us towards solutions can make it feel like the tensions and the conflicts are getting worse because they're moving to the surface, because people are willing to challenge the keepers of entrenched power. So in that sense, I don't think it's an accident that the conversation about the diversity of our Unitarian Universalist national leadership happened when our president was a Latino. The fact that we had a Latino at the top of a structure that was still a profoundly white supremacist and patriarchal structure kind of brought the contradiction to the surface in ways that generated a great deal of pain, but also the possibility for transformation. And similarly, the dynamic that we saw as a nation during the presidency of Barack Obama was the same kind of dynamic. The presence of a person of color at the top of a white supremacist system makes people feel freer to call to account the fact that the system as a whole is white supremacist, but also can make the pain of that white supremacy sting in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a very helpful framing of kind of what has happened in both the Unitarian Universalist Association and the United States, and why different forms of activism and different forms of questions have come up sort of more explicitly in the last decade than maybe had in the past, right? I mean, like, I think about, the question of, like, inclusion or integration or assimilation versus the question of, like, power or the radical reimagining of institutions, right? I mean, like, I think that one of the things that somebody like Barack Obama becoming president or Peter Morales becoming president of the UUA brought to the fore is exactly what you're talking about, the sort of realization of that, well, if we just integrate these institutions, their underlying logics will continue to function, right? Like, we'll still continue to have vast disparities of wealth, and who's at the receiving end of the violence, in society, whether or not we have a black president, or the UUA will continue to function largely as an institution that privileges the rights and priorities of white male ministers, which one could frame as a white supremacist organization, until such time as we radically reimagine how the structure and functions of these institutions is going to proceed. And I think that there's lots of interesting and challenging questions around social transformation that go along with that. I think that maybe a place that we could move into here, because I know we wanted to talk about, would be a different institution at Harvard, which is the American Studies program, which I'm a graduate of, and how some of these dynamics have played out within American Studies. Because I think American Studies is another sort of interesting or telling case of efforts to dismantle white supremacy, how they play out, and what some of the consequences are. So just, like when I got to Harvard, the program was still called the History of American Civilization. And I remember talking to actually somebody we've had on this program as a forum guest before, Tupac Enrique Acosta, about the fact, and he was actually one of my recommenders for that when I applied to Harvard. So I remember talking with him about this and being like, so I'm going to go to this program, History of American Civilization. And he was just totally horrified that this was the name. And he's like, what are these people doing? American civilization, what is that? And, I know that they're mostly talking about white people or people who think themselves as white. And, what is going on here? And then the program changed its name to American Studies, and there was a bunch of resistance to that on the part of some faculty while I was there. I'm not going to name names, but they were people who were particularly oriented to studying certain aspects of this country's culture and a particular tradition that emphasized the sort of centrality of New England elite institutions and literary culture over against over against ethnic studies in particular. And I hope this is still true. I haven't looked at the graduates. I mean, not the graduates, who you all are recruiting now, but one of the things that happened after we changed the name from History of American Civilization to American Studies was it really signaled to people of color that the program was, at least on some level, going to be more intentionally welcoming of ethnic studies and studying things other than 17th century Puritanism. And so the student body became, during my tenure, more diverse because there was a more diverse applicant pool. Now, whether that changed a lot of the underlying logics of white supremacy, I think is a really good conversation to sort of move into. But that was a shift that actually a lot of the students, including myself, advocated for while I was there. And there have been sort of repeated rounds of activism since then.
Yeah, so this is a really, it's a really beautiful case study. And you laid out, the main storyline that we had this ancient name, History of American Civilization. To be fair to the people who came up with that name at the early 20th century, American studies as a field of study was just kind of beginning to crystallize at that time. And there were a lot of other area studies programs at universities that had names like Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. And so the History of American Civilization was just kind of modeled on those names. And then gradually, as the discipline developed in lots of different places, American Studies became the standard name. And so when we changed the name, we imagined that we were mostly just aligning ourselves with the discipline nationally and getting rid of this old language that was a little bit old-fashioned sounding and gave a bad impression. And as you just said, Colin, we were amazed at how utterly transformed our applicant pool was as soon as we made that change. Prior to the name change, our applicant pool looked, demographically just like the applicant pools for the history department, the applicant pools for the English department, the applicant pools for the PhD program in religion and in art history and in music. These are the main disciplines that we overlap with as American Studies, which is to say all those applicant pools were much whiter than the pool of admitted students we were hoping to recruit. And suddenly, we had an applicant pool whose share of people of color was 2 or 3 times higher than the share in all of our sibling programs, except for African and African American Studies, which of course also had a very racially diverse applicant pool. And not only was it, more diverse in terms of the sheer numbers, the strongest candidates tended to be candidates working on ethnic studies projects who apparently not only were not comfortable with the history of American civilization language, but also weren't super comfortable with being under the rubric of a history department or an English department. They clearly felt that they would be best supported in a program bearing the label American Studies, or, many of them would have been applying to ethnic studies programs in other universities that have those programs. So we moved from a situation where a typical entering class was maybe, like your entering class, Colin, was probably 4 white people and 1 person of color. Is that right? Or
Well, mine, I think that if I remember correctly, my cohort was actually part of the precipitating issue around this. So my cohort, there were actually a couple, I think maybe 3 people of color.
Oh, I see. Yep.
And
yep.
then none of them enrolled. Right? It was sort of like we were pointed to as the great failure in the history of American civilization recruiting strategies. I mean, I don't think anybody framed it exactly in that way, but but we ended up with the cohort of 3 white men. Right, and there was a woman who was part of the cohort who.
Oh, right. Yep.
Ended up withdrawing after a year. So, or after 2 years. Anyways, yeah, I mean, so I think that, I know that talking to some of the faculty, I think including yourself, when this whole we need to change our name to American Studies question came up, we were pointed to as if you want to continue to have cohorts that look like that, then don't change the name. Otherwise, we really need to think about changing the name. And I think that some of the feedback you guys got from the students who decided not to enroll was specifically around the name, History of American Civilization versus American Studies. So,
yeah, I think some of them were definitely worrying, not only what it might mean for their experience at Harvard, but what it might mean for them on the job market down the road. So yes, so the name change allowed us to transform our applicant pool, and it also allowed us to transform our recruitment situation. So, for example, the class that will be entering in a couple of weeks is 4 people of color, 1 white woman, The class before them, I believe, is 3 people of color and 2 white people. Yeah. So we're now able to recruit classes that are majority people of color. But what this reveals is that white supremacy is not a problem that you can solve in one place. There's a whole chain of interconnected realities. And when you make progress in one place, you simply move the tension to a new place. So in my role, I'm currently chair of American Studies, and a lot of what I have to do in that role is work with students, mostly students of color, whose program has been disrupted because of repeated changes to their advising structure because of the departure of mentors who are also people of color. So this past fall, we had a particularly painful incident because a scholar named Melcher Garcia Pena, who works on Dominican American experience, and particularly the kind of complex interplay between the histories of the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and the United States. So the thesis of Melcher Garcia Pena's scholarship is that the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which is marked as black and the Dominican Republic as Latino, that border was actually constructed in the United States, that Haitians and Dominicans learned to see one another as racially different because of the imperial influence of racial boundaries constructed in the United States. So this is the scholar who's doing this kind of scholarship, really asking deep fundamental questions. And even though she had the unanimous support not only of her colleagues in the American Studies program, but of her colleagues in her home department, she was denied tenure through a Harvard tenure system that ultimately vests ultimate power in outside reviewers who are typically very senior scholars at other institutions who represent a previous, much wider generation of scholarship. And for many of the students, like one of her advisees had his undergraduate advisee denied tenure while he was a student at Yale as an undergraduate. So this is repeated trauma brought about by these kinds of tenure decisions that faces any of us who find ourselves leading programs where the majority of students are people of color. The last thing I wanted to talk about in relation actually gets at some of the research of another one of Colin's classmates in the American Studies program about meritocracy. One of the sneaky things about white supremacy is that in every generation, it takes a different guise. So when the idea of meritocracy emerged early in the 20th century as an antidote to sort of the old boy network of Harvard, where you only could go to Harvard and other elite universities if you'd gone to the right prep schools, meritocracy emerged as an antidote to that power structure. But in our world today, meritocracy is one of the primary faces of white supremacy. It shows up in the use of standardized test scores that have been proven again and again to be racially biased, but are nevertheless used to determine students' fate in higher education. And it just shows up in those dynamics that I was just talking about with the different applicant pools for programs based on their names. You might think that the applicant pool is just what you have, but small changes signal to some people their particular kind of merit is welcome here, and to other people that their particular kind of merit is not welcome here. So we've got a lot of work to do to really figure out how to find alternatives to meritocracy that put at the center the project that's been articulated so well in the UU Commission on Institutional Change of finding the leaders we need to take us where we truly want to go, with that destination being a beloved community where everyone can bring their full selves to the table. And this is going to be challenging for Unitarian Universalists because in a lot of ways we are just as entangled in the logic of meritocracy, which is basically a logic that says, if you've done well in school, you deserve more of society's goodies than other people deserve. As the religious group with the first or second highest level of educational attainment, we are thick in the meritocratic logic, and our challenge is to recognize that it, just as much as our history of participation in enslavement or colonization, is part of what we're challenged to overcome right now.
Well, Dan, I think that we're going to have to leave it there, and I want to thank you for coming on this program, and hopefully we'll get a chance to have you back at some point, because I think that there was a lot more that we could talk about on this subject and many other subjects. I guess maybe just as by way of closing, I feel like one of the things that you really just kind of highlighted in that last comment that is really so important is that these institutions of white supremacy have been created over time, and if we're going to dismantle them, we're going to have to think about how their logics keep reasserting themselves in different guises and try to dismantle the underlying logics. And I think that that is such a challenging but vital, crucial, central work to do, that I think it really does require this radical reimagining that things like the Commission on Institutional Change have done, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out both within the Unitarian Universalist Association and continues to play out at Harvard. So for those of you who've watched this video, if you found it to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. and features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. Our theme for this month is Now. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Vizcarra assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as it's possible for us to gather again. Please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.